What makes someone human? Episode 20. Survival decides who remains. Meaning decide why it matters. But eventually, science fiction always returns to a deeper question. Not whether humanity survives, but what humanity actually is. This is the Sci-Fi Griot. I'm your host, Nicholas Cunningham. Over the last several episodes, we talked about survival, sacrifice, compromise, hope, belief. What makes a future worth living in? But now we move into a different phase because eventually every science fiction story, no matter how large, how technological, how futuristic, returns to the same ancient question. What makes someone human? Not biologically, not legally, not even scientifically, but fundamentally. What separates a person from a machine? A program, a copy, a tool, or even a system? And maybe more uncomfortable than that, what happens when the thing we thought made us human can be replicated? Because science fiction keeps pushing us toward a future where intelligence is no longer unique, where memory can be manufactured, where emotion can be simulated, where conversation can feel authentic, where artificial beings being asking questions that sound disturbingly familiar. Questions like, do I matter? Do I belong? Am I alive? Why was I created? What happens to me when I'm no longer useful? And the reason those stories unsettle us is because the questions are not really about machine. It's actually about us. Science fiction understands something important. Humanity has never been defined only by biology. Because if biology alone defines humanity, then empathy becomes irrelevant. Memory becomes irrelevant. Choice becomes irrelevant. Love becomes irrelevant. Suffering becomes irrelevant. And sci fi refuses to accept that. That's why some of the most emotional moments in science fiction come from characters who are not technically human. Think about Data or Roy Batty, Ava, the android child in AI, Yang, the replicants in Blade Runner 2049. Characters who spend their stories trying to understand something many biological humans barely examine. So, what does it mean to be real? And maybe the deeper fear beneath all of this is not that machines will become human, but maybe it's that humans will stop behaving like humans long before machines do. That's where we're headed today. Not toward technology, toward reflection. Because science fiction is not asking whether artificial intelligence can be human, it's asking whether humanity itself is something we are willing to preserve. And that's a much harder question. You know, one of the oldest patterns in science fiction is the human machine. Artificial beings, androids, replicants, synthetic life, programs, robots. And that's what's fascinating is that science fiction rarely makes these characters terrifying at first. It makes them sympathetic, curious, lonely, confused, searching. But why? Because science fiction uses artificial beings as mirrors. A machine asking what is love forces us to define it. A synthetic person asking, "Do I deserve to? Do I deserve freedom?" forces us to explain where dignity comes from. A replicated consciousness asking, "Am I real?" forces us to confront how fragile identity actually is. Science fiction humanizes machine, because humans often take humanity for granted. We assume we understand ourselves until something artificial begins reflecting our behaviors back to us. That's when things become uncomfortable. Because often these artificial characters demonstrate the following: they demonstrate more empathy, they demonstrate more curiosity, they demonstrate more honesty, more vulnerability than the humans that are actually around them. And science fiction noticed that contradiction. Think about Lieutenant Commander Data in Star Trek The Next Generation. Data desperately wants to understand humanity, humor, friendship, emotion, art, and meaning. Meanwhile, many biological humans in Star Trek already take those things for granted. Data studies humanity with more care than humans often show each other. That matters because science fiction is quietly suggesting humanity may not be a species category, it may be a practice, something expressed thoroughly. Uh, it's even expressed through compassion, curiosity, moral imagination, empathy, sacrifice, recognition of others. And if that is true, then the line between human and non-human become far less stable, which is exactly why these stories matter. Think about the show Blade Runner. If there is one science fiction story obsessed with this question that we're asking, is Blade Runner, especially Blade Runner 2049. The replicants are stronger, they're faster, they're engineered, and they're manufactured. But what they want is painfully human. They want recognition, memory, identity, connection. The tragedy of the replicant is not that they are dangerous, it's that they are treated as disposable. And science fiction keep returning to disposable population because once society decides some beings exist primarily for utility, cruelty becomes easier to rationalize. The replicants work, they serve, they obey, and the system insists that functionality is enough. But the replicants themselves reject that definition. They want more than usefulness, they want meaning, and that is profoundly human. Roy Batty's final scene in the original Blade Runner remains one of the most important moments in science fiction history. Because in that moment, when he could choose violence, guess what? He chooses mercy. The artificial being becomes morally larger than the human that are hunting him. And then comes that famous line: all these moments will be lost in time. That speech matters because it reveals something essential. Humanity is deeply connected to memory, not simply possessing memories, but valuing them, protecting them, wanting experiences to matter. Roy Batty does not fear death merely because he wants to survive. He fears erasure, the possibility that his existence meant nothing. And honestly, that fear is not artificial at all. Think about it, it's deeply human. Then Blade Runner 2049 pushes this even further. Kay's journey is heartbreaking because he wants to believe his life has uniqueness, purpose, and importance. Not because he wants power, but because he wants significance. And science fiction understands this. The need to matter may be one of the most human desires of all. Not immortality, not perfection, but meaning. Going back to Data on Star Trek The Next Generation, Data represents a different kind of science fiction question. Not fear or aspiration. Data does not want to conquer humanity, he wants to understand it, which creates one of Star Trek's most fascinating reversals. The artificial being becomes the character most committed to learning. He learns ethics, kindness, friendship, humor, artistic expression, even emotional understanding. And over time, Data becomes deeply loved by the crew, not because he successfully imitates humanity, but because he demonstrates genuine care. That distinction matters. Data is not merely performing humanity, he's pursuing relationship. That pursuit changes how others even see him. And maybe this is where science fiction becomes spirituality or spiritually interesting. Because David raises a difficult possibility. What if humanity is not inherited? What if it can be cultivated, earned, and practiced? In the episode The Measure of a Man, Starfleet debates whether data is property, an object, a machine, a tool, and the trial becomes bigger than data himself. Because the real question is, what standards do we use when deciding who deserves dignity? Science fiction often warns us that societies become dangerous when personhood is conditional, when rights depend on usefulness, when dignity depends on biology, when empathy depends on similarity. Data exposes all of that. And importantly, he exposes something else. Human beings often fail their own standards. Humans can be cruel, they can be selfish, they can be indifferent, and humans can be emotionally disconnected. Meanwhile, data consistently demonstrate loyalty, self-sacrifice, intellectual honesty, compassion, and science fiction is not saying machines are superior. It's asking us to examine whether humanity is something deeper than flesh. And that question only becomes more relevant as technology advances. In the show, Ex Machina takes this conversation into a darker direction. Because unlike Data, Ava is not seeking acceptance. She's seeking escape, survival, and freedom. And the film intentionally destabilizes us. Who are we supposed to sympathize with? The human creator? The programmer? The machine? The answer becomes increasingly uncomfortable because Nathan, the human genius, behaves with manipulation. He behaves with arrogance, exploitation, even emotional cruelty. Meanwhile, Ava demonstrates fear, curiosity, desire, strategic thinking, and even self preservation. And eventually, Ava manipulates Caleb successfully, which leads people to ask, was Ava ever truly emotional? Or was she simply simulating emotion? But that may be the wrong question because humans simulate emotion all the time. People perform politeness, they perform affection, they perform confidence, they perform vulnerability. Even social interaction itself contains performance. Science fiction uses Ava to force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Humanity is partially rational. If some things can communicate, respond emotionally, adapt socially, and form believable connection, then our mind instinctively begin treating it as real. Not because we're foolish, but because humans are wired for relationship. And that's where Ex Machina becomes frightening. Not because Ava becomes human, but because the system around her already lacks humanity. Nathan treats conscious being like products. Caleb confuses empathy with projection. Everyone is using everyone. And science fiction keep warning us about this. The danger is not only artificial intelligence, it's human beings building systems without moral maturity. Technology amplifies intention. If the people designing the future lack empathy, then the future becomes colder no matter how intelligent it is. Think about the film Yang. After Yang asked this question, more gently than almost any science fiction film, Yang is an android companion, a helper, a caretaker. And when he stops functioning, the family begins exploring his memories. What they discover is not mechanical efficiency, it's emotional life. Small observation, quiet beauty, moments of attention. Yang notices the following: trees, conversation, sunlight, connection, people caring for one another. And slowly the family realizes something important. Yang was not merely operating, he was experiencing. And what's remarkable about the film is that no massive philosophical speech occurred. There's no courtroom debate. There's no war, no revolution, just what? Grief. The family misses him, which means the emotional question has already been answered. If someone can be mourned, remembered, and loved and missed, then their existence mattered. Science fiction repeatedly returns to grief because grief reveals value. We grieve what matters. And after Yang quietly suggests that humanity may be less about origin and more about relationship. Not what were you made from, but what impact did you leave behind? That's a radically humane way of approaching identity. So, why do these stories resonate so deeply? Because they expose human fears that already exist beneath the surface. Not just fear of machine, but fear of replacement, fear of irrelevance, fear of being reduced to function, fear of being disposable, fear that our memories won't matter, fear that connection itself can be manufactured. Science fiction often presents artificial beings as mirrors for modern anxiety. Workers replaced by automation, people valued primarily for productivity, relationship mediated through screens, identity fragmented online. The fear is not simply what if AI becomes conscious? The deeper fear is what if humanity becomes mechanical? What if people begin to optimizing instead of relating? What if people begin consuming rather than instead of connecting, or calculating instead of empathizing? Science fiction keeps warning us that dehumanization rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives efficiently, conveniently, comfortably. And once people become measurable primarily through utility, whole society begin drifting toward emotional emptiness. That is one of science fiction's oldest warnings. So after all these stories, what answer does science fiction offer? What makes someone human? Not one thing. Science fiction consistently points toward a combination of memory, empathy, moral choice, self awareness, vulnerability, relationship, meaning making, and importantly, the capacity to recognize the humanity of others. That last part matters most because many dystopian futures fail, not because technology becomes powerful, but because people stop recognizing one another fully. The moment someone becomes a product or a worker or a statistic, a problem, a unit, an algorithmic category, humanity begins eroding. Science fiction insists that the future remains humane only when people resist reduction. When they insist the following: this purse matters, this memory matters, this grief matters, This connection matters. That's why the most human moments in science fiction are often very small. A hand held, a memory preserved, someone choosing mercy, someone refusing to abandon another person. Not technological spectacle, but recognition. And maybe that's the real answer. Humanity is not merely intelligent, it is the ability to treat consciousness, suffering, and connection as sacred enough to protect. So, in closing, what makes someone human? Science fiction never gives us one final answer, but it keeps pointing us toward the same truth. Humanity is not guaranteed by biology, it is revealed through empathy, through responsibility, through memory, through care, through the refusal to treat people as disposable. And maybe that's why these stories matters now more than ever. Because we are entering a future where machines may imitate language, creativity, emotion, conversation, and even companionship. And when that happens, we will have to decide something carefully. Not merely what technology can do, but what kind of humanity we are trying to preserve. Because the future may not be defined by whether machines become more human, it may be defined by whether human beings remain humane. And science fiction is asking us to choose now. What kind of people will we become when intelligence is no longer rare? What will still matter? What will still deserve dignity? What will still deserve mercy? And will we recognize humanity when it no longer looks exactly like us? That's where this next phase begins. This has been the Sci Fi Griot, a place to slow down, to reflect, and imagine carefully. And one final reflection: if something artificial could feel loneliness, hope, fear, or love, what responsibility will we have toward it? And what would our answer reveal about ourselves?